If you're a manager or a strategic planner or any type of strategic stakeholder, and you cannot predict the future when it comes down to planning and rolling out strategic initiatives and decisions, this is the next best thing. It is called a premortem, and it's been developed by famous psychologist Gary Klein, and it's been made especially to identify and mitigate unseen risks. Now, try to think of the last time that you were running a project or that you had made a decision, and in the end, it turned out a bit worse or maybe a lot worse than you expected. There was an outcome that you simply didn't predict and that you couldn't see coming. Now, with a premortem, you will be way more likely to see these black swan type of scenarios and mitigate them proactively. It's going to make planning and decision-making a lot safer, a lot more fun, and it's going to yield a lot better results. So let's dive into it. The rationale behind the premortem and the ability for it to spot unseen risks is because it directly mitigates a couple of biases. Now, we have these cognitive biases. We know that we have them, and even the best managers and executives are prone to them. Now, think of errors like the planning fallacy. There is a famous airport in Germany that was supposed to be done in construction within, I think it was 6 to 7 years. And in the end, the production process lasted over 15 years and the costs overrun exceeded billions of dollars that were not expected for. So there was a huge planning error. And in behavioral psychology, we call this the planning fallacy. Humans are overly optimistic when it comes down to making planning decisions. And this is not something that has anything to do with our IQ. It has to do with our cognitive ability when we're planning. We're optimistic in making it work fast, but when we make complex business decisions, we are often overly optimistic. Another thing is that even the best managers cannot factor in risks they have never seen before. So risks that they don't know exist. These are called the black swan risks. You probably have heard of this book by Nicholas Nassim Taleb, The Black Swan, that goes into how there are points at the end of each outcome of decisions, of the distribution of outcomes that are way in the end. So they're called the black swans. They're very low probability of occurring, but when they occur, it's often a disaster. Now, since, as I said, we're quite optimistic when it comes down to decision making, we often neglect these black swans. We see these tiny risks as zero risks, which is not the desired outcome, because we have to factor in all risks when it comes down to decision making. Another bias is that when we make decisions about planning in groups, we don't always speak up to key decision makers. So we have a group. Imagine yourself being in a room with a couple of strategic planners and high-level stakeholders, and maybe your VP is there as well. And you have experience with these type of projects, but you know and you see that we're being a bit overly optimistic. We might need 3 months more. We might need an X amount of budget more to be allocated before we start. But since everyone else seems to not have any problems or are not seeing this, you're a bit scared to speak up, and you don't want to point out to your VP that they have planning fallacy or that they are overly optimistic. So this is a common problem as well. The authority bias has a lot of influence on how we dare to speak up in decision making. Now, how can we use a premortem to avoid these types of biases from happening and to avoid cost overrun, to avoid exceeding time and stakeholder resources to be spent on a project that we didn't know we were going to spend? You have to conduct a premortem, and I'll give you a quick rundown of how you can go about this. You have to divide the decision-making group into two teams, basically. So imagine this happening in one of the last meetings that you have before you make a big decision or before you start rolling out a project. And you can do this in an existing meeting, right? But take 30 minutes, you can take 10 minutes, you can even take 90 minutes, but take some time to do this. So you split the group up in two, and you can call one group the black swan group and one group the white swan group. Other names that are being used is calling the black swan group the premortem group and the white swan group the pre-parade group. Basically, what it comes down to is one group is going to predict and try to describe as best as they can what the worst possible outcome would be of a project, of a decision, of whatever scenario. And the other group, this white swan group or the pre-parade group, is going to do the same, but then with the best possible outcome. So you give both groups a little bit of time to write up what this scenario would look like, help them travel 6 months or a year or 2 years into the future and really help them pick out the details. What does it look like? What does the disaster scenario look like? And when they have described that, you challenge both groups. You do a round around the group. You just ask people like, what does it look like? Tell me a reason that this project might fail. Or in the other group, tell me a reason that this project might succeed even better than we thought it would. And while you collect all these reasons, there is you're leveling the playing field of conversation. So everyone is retrospectively thinking about this and is coming up with all these ideas. Like maybe we failed because in the week before go live, we noticed that we have way too little people that are working in customer support. So maybe we need to pay a little more attention to that. Maybe the VP is saying something like, well, maybe if we turn out to have a lot of cost overrun in the last quarter of this project, these marginal costs are going to outweigh the initial investment. So let's make sure we get that right up front. And by traveling to this future scenario, you make it a lot easier to talk comfortably, to speak up in a safe environment about what could go wrong and what can go right. And a pro tip here, don't let the most senior stakeholders speak first. When you do rounds, when you ask people their ideas about the worst and best case scenario, don't let the most senior stakeholders speak first. Just let them go, but not as the first person to speak. And also just give everyone the chance to name 1 or 2 things, but don't let one stakeholder list 10 things and make it more exhaustive for the other ones. So when you have described these scenarios, the real fun part starts, and this is where you work backwards. So you challenge both teams to work backwards from either disaster or parade scenario and identify the red flags, all these things that could go wrong in a reverse roadmap. So you're documenting what could go wrong by every step, but not by traveling from where you are now to where you might go, but from a predefined disaster or success scenario, and you go all the way back. Now, what you're doing here is basically standard project management procedure, but the other way around. You're creating a reverse roadmap. You're identifying the critical failure and critical success factors by switching your mental point of view from present to future. And this is how you deal with all these biases. And again, you can do this, especially when this becomes habitual. You can do this in 2 to 5 minutes. But especially when you do this for the first time, I would definitely recommend you take an hour to an hour and a half to get the process going. And there are lots of templates that you can use for this as well. And to help you on your way a little bit, these are a couple of questions that you want. So imagine you're in that last meeting before you start a project. You have said that we're going to do a pre-mortem. All the strategic stakeholders are there. You're splitting them up into 2 groups. You invite them to describe that worst case scenario or the best case scenario, depending on what group they're in, and to work backwards. And these are some questions that you can use to help them prompt ideation. Questions like, what could slow us down or make us miss a big deadline before launch? What could happen? What are we already nervous about right now? What are we feeling in the pits of our stomachs? Be analogous as well. Ask them about previous projects or analogous projects that might look like this one. What went wrong there? How can we make sure that that doesn't go wrong here? What learnings do we have? How quickly can we respond when something goes wrong? Because this is a critical point. What are the biggest risk areas that we have right now? And how can we kind of group them? How can we define them per stakeholder? So by asking all these questions, but asking them from the future scenario, you can really increase the sharpness of stakeholders. But you're doing so in a safe way. We are in the future scenario, but it hasn't happened yet. So the real risks attached to that, career risks, personal risks, are not playing up yet. And what you usually see is that when the first time you do a pre-mortem, things might get a bit uncomfortable because you thought you were all set up for success. And then by doing this pre-mortem, you're identifying all these risks that could have been prevented and now will be prevented. And that's probably the last takeaway that I want to give to you. When you have conducted a pre-mortem, make sure that you have a minute taker that writes everything down and that also in accordance with the group assigns follow-up tasks, assigns owners to the risks that we have now identified, and make sure that accountability and responsibility are distributed in the right way so that you can follow up on these things. When the project starts, make sure that you have a follow-up meeting on your pre-mortem every other month or every other week if you want to be really fast. And make sure that you proactively identify these critical success and critical failure factors in such a way that you can keep factoring them in, and that you make sure that these unseen risks that are now seen will not get in the way of your project. So good luck with rolling out a Premortem, and I would wish you the best in practicing this and putting this into practice once, twice, and make it into a good habit for you and your colleagues.